Welcome you all from the USC Emeriti Center and the University Club. Kristen and I are just delighted to have these wonderful women with us today to have a casual conversation. This is a casual conversation, and I would like to start with introducing our first panelist, Professor Emerita and Vice Provost Emerita Barbara Solomon. She was the first Black Dean of the USC Graduate School and widely referred to as the conscience of USC and the initiator of the Neighborhood Academic Initiative. She played a key role for DEI before it was even identified. Next panelist is Staff Assembly President and Senior Associate Director of Auxiliary Services, Initiatives and HR Events. Erika Chesley has served on the President's Commission. She has been instrumental on the university's DEI work, forming the Ad Hoc Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee in 2019. Jada Salazar, our third panelist, is a USC Caldwell Scholar, USC Marshall Gores Scholar as well. She serves as the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Marshall Student Government and is an AP Alumni Council member at the College Board. She's also on the Learning Environment Task Force at USC and is a sophomore at the Marshall School of Business. So we welcome our panelists, and I take it and give it over to Kristen Todd, who represents our wonderful University Club.
Well, thank you, Jeanette. We just love doing co-hosted events, especially with the Emeriti Center. It is so nice to see so many wonderful faces on this call today. And I just welcome you from the Amy King Dundon Berchtold University Club. Just as a reminder, this is being recorded and this will be featured, I know, both on the Emeriti Center and the University Club's website after. So if you have to pop off at some point, no worries, you're welcome to view the rest of the session later. And as we go, I would love for you to put your questions in chat. We can send those to our moderator. And then one last suggestion, a few of you might have already heard this, but it might help to put your screen in speaker view. So you can do that by going to the top right corner of your Zoom screen, and there's a little box that looks like a Rubik's Cube. And if you click on that, you can hit speaker view, and then you'll be able to see our speakers as they come on and have this wonderful conversation that's ahead of us. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Marie Martin. She is a former K-12 educator and a current full-time student with a dissertation called Saving Marginalized Communities: Implementation Strategies for Moving Public School Districts from Education 2.0 to Education 4.0. She's also currently the CEO of Alexandria's Design, an education consulting firm specializing in culturally responsive instructional and curriculum design. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our fabulous panel. Thank you again for coming today, and let's get on with it.
Ms. Todd, thank you so much for introducing me, and Dr. Brown, thank you so much for having me as well. I just want to say that I am absolutely humbled to even be in the room, in the presence with these three wonderful women. And I aspire to be you one day when I grow up. And I'm excited about our conversation today and all of the new wonderful ideas that will come out of our conversation today. This is truly intergenerational. So the first question that I have, and I'm actually going to start with Dr. Solomon, and I want to know, what are some positive influences that have led to your success throughout the years?
Oh, I'm delighted to speak about that because as intergenerational, I am sure that the things that inspired me were far before many of you were aware of what was going on in the world. I grew up in the South. I grew up in totally segregated school systems. My mother was a teacher. My father was a Pullman porter. And they always made it clear that education was the way to success and expected me to do that. So they were a fierce kind of supporter of my success and making it clear what I needed to do to succeed. But the other point was my undergraduate experience at Howard University, a historically Black college, which again left no excuses that we were supposed to succeed. And the diversity in that university, because we had African American students from all over the country, but we had from the Caribbean, we had from newly independent countries in Africa, and we had many Jewish faculty because they had come after the Holocaust and found anti-Semitism. So diversity was something that was in the DNA of that educational experience, and something that I am sure that is experienced by my generation that was not experienced later.
I think that's absolutely wonderful. That education is the stronghold and the driver for a lot of what we do, right? I'm going to pass the floor over to Ms. Chesley, and I'm going to ask you what you think is some positive influences that have led to your success so far.
Thank you so much. And before I say anything, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge Dr. Solomon. Dr. Solomon was at USC when I was an undergrad, and even though we never really had a personal connection, every Black student on campus knew who Barbara Solomon was. And so I just want to take this moment to, express that and to thank you for all that you've done. So, when I think back on, what's led to the success that I've experienced, I look at three factors: knowledge, community, and then access. And for me, that very first part of community are the people that really helped me with my start. And so my grandparents were very influential on me during my upbringing. They left Arkansas in the early 40s, basically trying to get away from the Jim Crow laws and the sharecropping, rules and policies that were in place at that time. And so they just really demonstrated for me hard work and resilience. And then I look at my parents and my bonus parents. My bonus parents are my aunt and uncle. Both were educators, both graduated from Cal Berkeley, and really, kind of took me under their wing as if I was one of their children, and always pushed the importance of, an education. And so growing up, in the shadow of USC, I grew up just right down on West Imperial Highway. I always knew that I wanted to come to USC to further my education, and really had that strong start because of them.
Wonderful. So I see that there's a little motif happening with the education. I love the hard work and resilience building. And I love the fact that you mentioned the word community and access, which is so important for mentoring each other, right? Mm-hmm. And then Ms. Salazar, tell me, you've accomplished so much at such a young age. What is your positive influence?
First and foremost, I'm very humbled and honored to be on this panel amidst such amazing Black women. In regards to that question, so I grew up in South Central Los Angeles. I'm also a former foster youth, and I would say some educational challenges that I kind of had to deal with was in regards to resources and going to an inner city school that came from underprivileged background. And I think that honestly, what led to my success is my grandmother. She came from Belize, and she always instilled that education was our only way out of poverty. And so with everything that I ever did, I always wanted to, make her proud, and that her immigrating from Belize to here was worth it, and just extending those opportunities, not only for myself, but for my siblings and anyone who comes after me. And then I would definitely say, like, within school, my teachers and principals and counselors, they were most definitely extensive resources that I utilized. I'm really like a negotiator, and I'm very friendly, and I love meeting new people. And I think that speaking to them kind of really helped to create a safe space for me, and also a space for resources.
Thank you so much for a wonderful answer. And I'm going to also ask about some of the factors that you had to overcome. And I'm actually going to start with Ms. Chesley first.
You know, I think when I think about factors that I had to overcome, you know, I'll go to, you know, my career development. You know, one thing is that there will always seem to be two sets of rules, the rules for them and then the rules for us. And, you know, accepting that that is the case and coming up with, you know, a workaround. You know, another factor that I often faced during my career development was, you know, feeling safe enough to expand the circle of trust that I had in the work environment with those that were around me. And those are really the two things that first come to mind.
Yeah, I think that's pretty interesting because I experienced that, and I believe in your background you also attended USC as an undergrad as well, and that's a connection we have too, because I also attended USC as an undergrad and found many struggles with the double sets of rules that even happened within the university setting, right? Dr. Solomon, I'm sure you have like a list.
I can think of so many, but one that really stands out for me is the difficulty I sometimes had in making decisions about whether I could support individual students versus the kind of long line. For example, I had a student who came to me and wanted me to be on his dissertation committee. And that happened over and over again. And I was getting overcome almost with the requirements of trying to help and assist students and feeling very concerned about some of the reasons they were coming to me in the first place. For example, the student said, I want to do my dissertation on things that are happening in the inner city, and there's nobody on my committee or in my department who really have an understanding of that. And at that particular point, the person outside member of the committee was from the graduate school, who was supposed to see that everything was going according to graduate school regulations. But I was concerned about what this student was experiencing, and feeling that if I did accept, that I was in fact not providing incentive for the department to really get faculty who were absolutely understanding about the community issues that this student wanted to do. So I said to the student, I can't be on your committee because I really want you to go to your faculty and insist that they get faculty who can support students like you. I will be available to you anytime you want to come in and talk to me. I will support you as much as I can, but I've got to stop being the outside person who comes in to absolutely support the status quo. And that was extremely difficult, extremely difficult.
Yeah, I think that when you mentioned that, it's almost like you had the extra duty, and you had to almost remove that barrier and make it aware, or to light that these things were happening within the university, so that
Absolutely.
everyone can really do their jobs, right? And Ms. Salazar, tell us your experience. You can even talk about your past, any type of things that you've had to overcome factors in your life. And I think you've touched on it a little bit already, but you can go ahead and tell us a little bit more.
Say, like a main factor for me is like, I think that coming into USC, and even prior to that, I've always dealt with the imposter syndrome and feeling like I'm always behind, or that I have to work 3 times harder than anyone else to, be noticed, and be recognized. And so I think for me that's probably one of my major issues. And also within being at USC, I always have like this feeling of feeling alone, especially in Marshall, when every single class you go into, you're the only Black individual. And it's like, when do I get to see people like me? When do I get to see professors like me? And I think that honestly, it's a mental strain that I've had to overcome. And definitely participating in panel discussions like this and being exposed to the Black woman that exists within USC has definitely helped me persevere with that.
And I'm going to stay with you for a moment and just give you a follow-up question, because I want to know, we know our experiences as Black women at USC, but what type of positive things do you see in academia right now, or some positive things that are happening right now within the school environment, within the university system?
So when I first came into USC, I was invited to be a part of the Global Leadership Program. And so basically they take about the top 10% of freshmen, incoming freshmen. And it's like this exclusive program where eventually over the summer, you get an internship, and in the spring you go to China. And so the first Black person that I was introduced to within that program was Dr. Little, who she's no longer our Dean of DEI, but she was the first person I was introduced to, and everyone that I've ever spoken to always referred me to her. And from that experience, and just the fact that she was the only Black woman that I ever met at Marshall's campus, I took that, submitted evaluations to my professor, and eventually that led to basically the professor recognizing that diversity and inclusion was really essential in terms of seeing people that look like you within these business settings. And so I think in regards to that, there has most definitely also been many opportunities that have opened just amid the Black Lives Matter movement, for people recognizing the importance of the movement. But prior to that, in MBSG, I advocated for a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee, because it was just very odd to me that one did not exist. And so eventually the president came around and was like, yes, we're going to do this. Then a month later, George Floyd, that incident happened. And I think from then on, all of my peers were able to see the effects of what it was to be a Black individual. And within that moment, I gained their sympathy, but also their empathy. And so in regards to now, I would say that there are those opportunities that exist.
And I'm going to continue with that question on to Ms. Chesley, because there's a couple of things happening with you and Dr. Solomon, is the fact that, and even Ms. Salazar, is the fact that all three of you were working on DEI and vocal about DEI issues before it was like cool and in style, right? And so Ms. Chesley, I'm gonna point this to you. The improvement for Black women in general, but also you can expand upon your DEI work as well at the university.
Right, so thank you. And that is a great question. So when I became president of Staff Assembly, we did not have a DEI committee in place. Maybe about a year prior, we did have one that just kind of fell to the wayside and was no longer active. And so my very first year, I said, you know what, let's go on and bring an ad hoc committee back so that we can start doing this important work in DEI. And I was able to do that because of my position I'm really happy to say that the committee has become a permanent part of Staff Assembly, not because of any one thing that I did, but because all 60 members of Staff Assembly, which represents a very diverse group of individuals from across the campus, unanimously voted to have DEI as a permanent committee. And I'm happy to look through this room and see that I do have several of our Staff Assembly members here present. And that speaks to the fact that it's not just something that can be driven by or needs to be driven by those of us who are Black, but that it can be accepted by a broader audience. Now, in terms of, I want to go back and kind of talk a little bit about, what Jada said in regards to being, the only Black student at Marshall, and I can say that I had the exact same experience when I was here. And I think I've mentioned to you all that, my first round at Marshall it wasn't called Marshall, it was just called the School of Business back in the olden days. But that also continued in my career path. Before coming back to USC 11 years ago as a full-time employee, I worked for Hilton Hotels Corporation for over 21 years. I'm happy to see Bill Holland in the room, someone that I know from, back during those days. And I can say that in those 21 years and the 11 years that I had here, I never once, I'm gonna correct this in a second, but I never once had a Black director or boss. There was never a Black general manager. There was never a Black director of sales and marketing. In most cases, I was the first Black person to be a sales manager in my hotel. Now that has changed. I'm happy to say here at USC, I did have, for a very short time, a Black director in my department, and I'm hopeful that some of the work that we'll be doing here in DEI under the leadership of our new chief director that will become, chief officer who will be coming in on March 1st, will really help us to take account of where we have these gaps in representation, and so that we'll be able to move forward in a more positive fashion.
Mhm.
No, thank you. And there is research just released, I believe, early last year, talking about how there needs to be more diversity in the C-suite throughout the U.S. And so yeah, it's a huge problem not seeing ourselves, even though we want to strive to those levels. And I'm going to pass that over to Dr. Solomon, because I'm sure you have a lot to say on this issue as well.
I certainly do. It's bringing back memories, because I recall when there was an organization called the Faculty Wives Club here at the university. Much later, because they were the spouses of faculty, and the faculty was so male that they could have a faculty wives club, these women. And there were a few women on campus who were very concerned about that, and they gave them an opportunity to come to their meetings. And one of our faculty in the School of Social Work suggested that at one of their dinner meetings that they usually had, when they invited their spouses, and they would have someone come and speak, that I should come and speak about anything I really wanted to talk about to these mostly men and women at USC. And so I decided to talk about institutional racism. At that time, institutional racism was the concept rather than systemic, but that's the source of it. And so I went in to talk about institutional racism so that in our policies, we may unintentionally discriminate. And so therefore we had to look at the policies of how we recruited faculty. I went through all of this, and at the end they could ask questions, and I could see that some of these men were really getting very kind of upset. And one man said to ask the question, he said, well, when we recruit, we look for people who on the basis of their resumes, and we don't care whether they are blue, green, or black. That's what we do. And I said, well, when you want to recruit your football coach, I think that you do something other than just send out a statement that there is a position open. You go and look to see whether that football coach has what you really want. And then another one said, well, my problem is that when we find someone Black, they want more money than anybody else. I said, well, they taught me in economics, supply and demand. And if we are in short demand and when there are very few of us, we can demand more money. So I was not taken very well at that at that particular meeting, but I did have after that a couple of the wives come back to tell me that their husbands had really thought about some things that they hadn't thought about before. So it is early on, it was very clear that institutional racism was not being handled very well at the university.
Mm, mm. And then what types of progress did you see? And maybe you know, I know that you deal a lot with the university still today. What type of progress have you seen in all of your experience?
I have seen an awful lot of progress. And a lot of times you had to disentangle racism and misogyny for Black women. I mean, sometimes it was being female and sometimes it was being Black and sometimes it was being both. And so I can recall that when a new president came in, and we had the first woman who was actually from the School of Social Work, Frances Feldman, who chaired the academic council and brought up the issue when we were looking for a new vice president, that we needed to be making sure that we had in the final presentations, we had some person of color. And that became a kind of turning point where the issue was, you have got to consider the need for diversity in the university. And there were changes. And of course, over time, it's very clear that you can often have a policy, but accountability becomes the real issue. How do we keep it so that it's not just a statement, but is actually an action that is to be taken?
Moving beyond that performative gesture, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Turn into goals and then turn into actionable goals, right?
Absolutely.
From your conversation, I noticed your conversation on intersectionality, the intersectionality of women and also being African-American Black women, right?
Yes.
And I'm going to actually pose this question to Ms. Chesley because, and I'm gonna hold you last on this question, Dr. Solomon, because I just love your response to it. and from an interview I heard of yours, but Ms. Chesley, there is this intersectionality that we have as educated women coming from a tier 1 school like a USC and working in that DEI platform. Tell me some of your experiences. I'm noticing myself, I get a lot of pushback as I try to do my work in this area. And they say, well, what are you talking about? You come from USC. Nothing's happened to you, right? So if you could just kind of I want to open up that conversation first with Miss Chesley.
You know, it is true. People think that we, you know, because we come from this environment that maybe, you know, our experience is different. The experience is there. It's just, you know, in some ways, you know, it's hidden or it can't be seen, but we do feel it. You know, it's a tough thing to process. I would say that and I'm sorry, I'm getting I'm getting my thoughts together. So bear with me for
Take
just
your
one
time.
for just one
Yeah.
quick second. So I've had the privilege of sitting on several committees because of my office with Staff Assembly. Most recently, I was on the READY Committee, which is the Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Task Force. And if any of you are available at 3:30 p.m. today, please come and check us out. We're having a Trojan Council event. I sat on the Site Selection Committee for our new Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer. I'm currently sitting on the Community Advisory Board for DPS, and these are all very well formed committees. These are committees that have been created by the president, they've been created by the vice president of human resources, and they have been very intentional with how they are designed. When you look, we were talking about the Brady Bunch, when you look at the boxes, you see very diverse faces, faculty, staff, students, community combined, and it's beautiful. It's a different thing though when you are in a Zoom that is not intentionally put together. That's when you really see that even though we may claim to be diverse and to practice inclusivity, that it isn't something that is natural to many of the people that we are working with and around. You know, and I'll give another example is I have a son who's a senior here at USC, and because of that, I'm on the private Facebook page, you know, for parents, and even reaching to the depths of the parents, same thing, you know, a post will be made and you'll have, you know, 50, 60 parents that are jumping in and making comments. And then, you know, another day, a comment comes up about something that is in our community or about a Black student or a Black experience. And it is just whisper, whisper, quiet. And so it makes it tough. But it's so apparent, but people don't see it, you know, and it's because of the lens that we're all looking through.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And then Ms. Salazar, I want to know about your experiences as far as doing DEI work, especially prior to the murder of George Floyd. And specifically, you know, even though you weren't at USC or you've been at USC for a couple of years now, I'm sure you're getting pushback on, you know, a lot of the accomplishments that you have, et cetera, et cetera. Tell me how you feel about that intersectionality.
I actually have an example of when intersectionality kind of became prevalent. I believe like a week after the George Floyd incident, I sent a message into one of my classes that is based on, you know, global leadership. And the statement was just regarding like my experience as a Black female within, you know, a classroom that's supposed to be diverse in regards to race, intelligence, and background, and how there were certain racially insensitive things that were said the year that I participated in the program, and that it bothered me. And given that moment, I had other, you know, women of color that supported my experience as well, and, you know, seconded. And then the weirdest thing ever like happened, and I would have never expected this. There was another Black individual, and he was male, and he stated that he's never experienced any of the things that we were talking about. Um, and it became a really quiet moment because now it's just like, well, it seems like it's just like a you thing, and that, you know, this is not this you what your story was is not representative of what you all go through. And so in that moment, it felt like I was discredited. Um, so in terms of that intersectionality, I feel like often our experiences are separated because of our genders. And simply because he was a respected Black individual or Black male within the group, more people sided with him than instead of recognizing what the others were saying. And I think that that would be a prominent experience for me in regards to intersectionality. And on the topic of my DEI work, I'm still facing pushback within the committee that I'm trying to, uh, have be beneficial for all Marshall students. Just simply because when they see me, they're just thinking that I only represent Black Lives Matter, and that's not the case. I'm a Latina. My family comes from Belize, and even on my father's side, it's very diverse there as well, and I have Native American in me as well, and so it's like I don't only represent being a Black woman or just Black Lives Matter, but that's what you see when you see me. You don't see all of my other cultures and ethnicities that are behind that. And so I think that there's a stigma attached to that, that when you have someone that represents diversity, equity, inclusion, usually 9 times out of 10, they are Black women, which I think is, also a potential problem. But with that as well, it's like you can't separate this person's race from what they're here to do. And I think that that's something that I'm still working with in regards to my committee. But I think that my organization is very open-minded and they are willing to learn.
I enjoy the fact that you mentioned that you have an experience that you were trying to share, and a Black male came in, gaslit you, and boom, it's over, right? And the experience I've noticed just from me, and the difference between how I was treated at USC and how my Black males are treated at USC, they're different. They are, and I believe it is because of that intersectionality. I remember going to school with a gentleman whose professors thought he was on the football team, so that's why he got through and had a great time at school. So, but he wasn't. So I'm going to end off this question with Dr. Solomon, because I think you had just this wonderful story that I saw of yours where someone was pushing back on the fact that you were an educated Black woman from USC, as you were talking about systemic racism, and the fact that you went to USC is what they were questioning. How could anything be wrong with your life, because you're a professor and a doctorate at USC, right?
Absolutely. And again, the notion that when Black women have actually achieved some high position or high status, the first issue is whether you achieve that through some affirmative action that said that you weren't as really well credentialed or what have you, that this was some exceptionality. And as a matter of fact, I had, when I actually was being considered for Dean of the School of Social Work, one of the faculty said to me, well, I want to make it clear that you're being considered not because you are Black, because a lot of people get these positions because of affirmative action, but you've really done very well. And he thought he was giving me a compliment, and I thought that he was revealing the attitude that so many women had to encounter when they were really achieving much more than any other candidate. And I can recall when we had a special, there was a time on campus when they would have a special day when all the parents and communities came to campus, and all of the schools did a presentation as to what was going on in their school. And the School of Social Work had a presentation, and one of the things that they had asked me to talk about was issue of institutional racism. And of course, in the question and answer session, one of the parents who'd come said, well, I don't understand what you're talking about because, you've got your doctorate from USC, you're a tenured faculty member here, and so how could you talk about being a victim of racism? And I said to him, you are indicating that I couldn't be in the federal government Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, that this ought to be all that I should aspire to, or that even if I had aspired to something else, I ought to be just satisfied with what I have. And I think that that is something that we encounter constantly. And we haven't mentioned how the students that we teach sometimes have come with their own attitudes, and sometimes it's as simple as language and the expression of language. And I can recall giving a lecture to a student, and I talked about um, the folks in a program who had done this. She came up to me, she said, I think you are too intelligent. Um, Folk is plural, and we don't put an S on the end of folk. And I'm looking at her, are you crazy? Here again, the kind, and I've told people many times that when I was growing up in the South, and we had to learn the national anthem. Well, growing up in Texas, I had to learn the Star Spangled Banner. I had to learn the Eyes of Texas, but I also had to learn the Negro National Anthem. And there are things that are part of our culture that are considered somehow negative that we have to deal with, and we have to encounter as Black women, as Black faculty, as Black administrators. And this is something that far too often is totally unacknowledged. So this is something we live with.
See, I knew it. It's beautiful, beautifully said. Thank you so much for your wisdom. I have plenty more questions, but I'm looking at the time and just trying to honor everyone's time. I can stay here all day listening to this, listening to all three of you. I do have a question from the chat, from the audience, and please, go ahead and we'll try to answer as many questions. One question from the chat for Jada and Barbara both spoke about their grandparents. Did stories of their grandparents, the stories of your grandparents' experiences influence how you made life choices throughout your lives? So we'll go ahead and start with Jada.
Most definitely. I look at my grandma as my mom, my dad, my grandma, my grandpa. At a very young age, I didn't really have an upbringing in regards to having a relationship with my father and my mother. And so my grandmother was my everything. I always make fun of her and like poke at her when she used to like help me count using beans. And I think about that all the time, like in my economics class or, in my calculus class. And, these little foundations that you've instilled in me that now have, grown into this big, beautiful tree of me being at USC. And so I most definitely would say that my grandmother has had a heavy influence in all the decisions that I make, and just knowing that I always have to push myself to be, better.
Absolutely wonderful. And because they specifically mentioned you, Dr. Solomon, I'm going to go to you next and talk, if you could just expand upon your grandparents and how did they make your life, or excuse me, how did the experiences influence how you made life choices throughout your life?
Absolutely. Recognize this, I'm at this other end of this intergenerational conversation. And my maternal grandparents were born as slaves. And so just before the Civil War. And so when they came to Texas and started farming on some property, and this was actually before Texas was a state. It was the Republic of Texas at that particular time, um, and they started farming on land that seemed to be vacant. And after several years, they were able. They were actually in court during Reconstruction because a lumber company had said that that land had been awarded to them by one of their clients. It went to court, and they actually were able to have a settlement in their favor. It was a lot of land, and they were actually given like 200 acres of land. And my mother was the youngest of their 14 children. And my grandmother made it very clear that her children were going to do better than they were, that they would have opportunities. My paternal grandparents, my my paternal, my father's mother had grown up in Alabama and was part Indian, and they actually escaped a possible lynching of one of their sons to Oklahoma. So all of these kinds of experience were told to me at night when we didn't even have electricity, but lanterns, and storytelling was extremely important. And the storytelling actually indicated that they were very, very religious. And in fact, my parents graduated from Paul Quinn, which was an AME sponsored college there in Texas. And the whole notion was that with the help of God, that you would be succeeding. And so the grandparents were extremely important in connecting us to an ancestry that was positive, that was beyond the slave experience, that we were in fact being on our way to the promised land. And so for that, the grandparents were extremely important in the successes that I've had later in life.
Thank you so much, Dr. Solomon. Thank you so much. Somebody in the chat just asked if you are authoring a book about your life, or if you have one out about your life.
Not quite. Not quite. Actually,
buying it.
Actually, I had been involved in developing this memoir before all of this craziness with the coronavirus came down. So it may be coming.
Yes, wonderful. I'm going to stop the conversation here, but you know what? It is not over, because this has been such a wonderful, wonderful conversation. Dr. Solomon, Miss Erika Chesley, Miss Jada Salazar, you are amazing, amazing, amazing. And someone said, please tell your story. And I say, tell all of your stories, because these stories need to be out there. And just thank you for this. But we're going to have this wow moment now, where I would love for everyone to just take a moment to think about something from the conversation today that will inspire you to take some type of action in your life within the next week. And then I'm actually going to say, who's gonna hold you accountable as well, right? Name someone who's gonna keep you accountable. But if there is something that you have heard from this conversation, you can definitely put it in the chat if you would like to share it with us, because we would love to see where you guys are. And if anything in this conversation has touched you today that is going to make you create a goal for yourself and action and place some action behind that goal within the next week, that would be a wonderful thing for you to do. Okay. And I just want to say again, thank you to all three of you, Dr. Solomon, Miss Erika Chesley, and Miss Jada Salazar. You guys are amazing with amazing lives and amazing stories that are still that you're still putting more impressions on everyone. And I'm going to hand it back to Dr. Brown and Ms. Todd and say thank you again for allowing us and having us here to have a conversation, an intergenerational conversation.
Thank you so much, Marie. That was fabulous. And these women are definitely inspirational. I saw in the chat that some would love to continue this. We hear this all the time, the intergenerational perspectives, but this one was just right out of the ballpark. Kristen, what would you like to say about it all?
Jess, thank you. And thank you all for coming and sitting here with us and hearing this amazing conversation. I think we were all are a little bit better placed because of it. You're inspirational. But also just, I think we can all probably step up and advocate more, right? I mean, that's my wow, is not, allies are good, advocates and beyond, right? Champions. So thank you.